In December 2016, in Kuala Lumpur, scientist Tanya Detto wheeled a yellow pelican case, sealed with 2 layers of protection, onto a helicopter. Inside were no expensive instruments or rare specimens, but thousands of tiny insects measuring less than 2 millimeters. Throughout the journey to an isolated Australian island, Tanya and her colleagues kept checking on them, even replacing each piece of cotton soaked in honey to keep the entire colony alive. Sometime later, on a wide grassy field, Tanya knelt down and carefully opened the container, releasing 18,000 foreign organisms across the island. They immediately headed toward the towering canopies of giant coral trees, as if searching for something. No one yet knew exactly what their purpose was, but the idea of introducing a foreign species sounded almost insane, and yet the government approved it. But over the next 2 years, what scientists recorded on the island surprised even them. Soon the world was stunned that such a tiny creature could transform an entire ecosystem and affect millions of inhabitants across the island. Christmas Island, one of Australia's most remote territories, is so isolated that it has become a world of its own, home to many endemic species. And yes, I'm talking about the red crabs. Every October, tens of millions of them leave the forest, pouring across roads and through people's yards on their way to the ocean. Residents have to drive slowly, while tourists stand along the roadside waiting for them to pass. This great migration has continued for thousands of generations. But then, an invader hundreds of times smaller than the crabs appeared and began bringing it all to a halt. The yellow crazy ant may be the most ruthless, invasive species ever to set foot on Christmas Island. Arriving around 100 years ago, and with no natural predators to keep it in check, it quickly became the worst ecological disaster in the island's history. They really do seem as crazy as their name suggests, moving incredibly fast, running in all directions, and behaving with extreme aggression. Whenever they detect prey or an enemy, nearby ants immediately swarm in huge numbers, covering the target and tearing into it until it dies. But the real danger lies beyond that. Normally, ant colonies from different nests fight each other over territory. Yellow crazy ants do not. Colonies separated by miles can still merge together, forming a supercolony. So even if you see countless nests scattered across the landscape, in reality, they may all be part of a single nest. Scientists once recorded one supercolony covering 1,850 acres and containing more than 7.5 billion ants, and the true number was almost certainly even more horrifying. Red crabs became the perfect victims. The ants did not need to bite through their hard shells. Instead, they sprayed formic acid directly into the crab's eyes and leg joints. It is one of the powerful acids found in nature. Within just 24 hours, an affected crab can begin spinning in circles, lose its sense of direction, develop stiffened legs, and eventually collapse from exhaustion. After killing the crabs, the ants take over their burrows and use them as places to raise their larvae. Since the late 1990s, around 15 million red crabs have died this way. From that point on, the ecosystem could never fully return to what it had once been. Before that, Australia had already tried a much more direct method to kill yellow crazy ants: poison bait. Starting in 2001, park rangers had to walk through the forest, weaving between massive ant colonies containing billions of individuals to spread ands-off bait containing fipronil. At times, helicopters were used to drop the bait across thousands of hectares. Within just a few days, worker ant densities could fall by as much as 99%, while the queens continued dying afterward. In 2002 alone, one campaign treated about 2,366 hectares. But the solution was still only temporary. As long as a few nests survived, the ants could quickly return and form new supercolonies. Worse still, fipronil could also affect many other invertebrates, so baiting had to be carefully controlled. At the same time, it required large amounts of manpower, time, and money to repeat the treatment again and again. But poison bait was not the only way to strike at the ant colonies. Looking more closely, Peter Green, Kirsty Abbott, and Dennis O'Dowd realized that the ants' most important weakness might not be on the forest floor at all, but on the trees above them. Clinging in dense clusters to branches and tree trunks were yellow, lax-scale insects, tiny creatures that barely move. They pierce plant tissue to suck out sap, then excrete honeydew, a sugar-rich liquid that yellow crazy ants are especially attracted to. You can think of these scale insects as tiny herds of livestock living in the trees. The ants constantly visit them to collect this high-energy food source, while also protecting the scale insects from predators and parasites. With that protection, the scale insect population grows, while the ants gain an increasingly abundant food supply that allows them to maintain enormous numbers and expand their supercolonies. The two species had unintentionally created a perfect feedback loop that benefited both sides. The more scale insects there were, the stronger the ant colonies became. And the stronger the ant colonies became, the better protected the scale insects were. But the scientists needed to know whether this was simply an interesting relationship or whether the scale insects were actually the fuel keeping the entire ant army running. So they carried out a field experiment. They prevented the ants from reaching the scale insect colonies in the trees and watched what happened. Just 4 weeks later, the result was clear. Ant activity on the ground dropped by about 95%. They did not need to kill billions of ants. Simply cutting them off from their main energy source was enough to make the entire system begin to weaken. This clever idea marked a real turning point in conservation thinking. But there was still one critical question. What kind of organism could kill the yellow lac scale without putting Christmas Island's unique ecosystem at risk? In 2009, the search took scientists to Malaysia, where yellow lac scale occurs naturally but rarely reaches the explosive numbers seen on Christmas Island. There, with support from the Forest Research Institute Malaysia, they focused on a creature only about 2 millimeters long, the parasitic wasp, Tacardiophagous somervillei. It does not sting people, hunt ants, or need to confront the supercolony at all. It simply searches for scale insects and lays its eggs inside their bodies. The larvae then hatch and feed on the host from within until the scale insect dies. A single wasp can parasitize more than 150 scale insects during its lifetime. Just 2 years after they were released into the wild, the wasps achieved something remarkable, something that poison bait had struggled to sustain over the long term, and the results stunned people around the world. But before reaching that point, Australian scientists first had to prove one crucial thing. How could they be sure this new wasp would not become the next invasive disaster? That concern was completely justified. Australia had already paid the price many times for introducing non-native species. One of the most famous examples came in 1935, when cane toads were brought to Queensland in the hope that they would eliminate beetles damaging sugarcane fields. But the toads failed to effectively control their intended target, while they themselves reproduced rapidly and spread across vast areas. Most dangerous of all was the poison in their bodies. Native predators such as northern quolls and large monitor lizards could die after trying to eat the toads. This time, scientists were determined not to repeat the cane toad mistake. Before a single wasp could be released on Christmas Island, Tacardiophagous somervillei had to prove that it was almost exclusively interested in the one target they wanted to eliminate: the yellow lac scale insect. In Malaysia, the wasps were exposed to 8 scale insect species closely related to the target. The scientists even conducted no-choice tests, placing the wasps with only a non-target scale insect. If they were hungry and had no other option, would they lay their eggs in a new host? The answer was no. They still waited for the specific scale insect they were specialized to parasitize. Researchers also tested whether the wasps could reach scale insects, while swarms of yellow crazy ants were guarding them, and they still could. But the detail that made this plan completely different from the cane toad story was that, according to project information, this parasitic wasp had actually been found on Christmas Island before. That's right, no one knew exactly how it had arrived there, but its population was simply too small at the time to have any meaningful impact. The goal was to amplify a natural enemy that was already present, building its numbers high enough to spread through the forest canopy and continuously put pressure on the scale insects. The scientists may have trusted the wasp, but convincing the Australian government and the public was another matter entirely. The project had to go through years of risk assessments, environmental reviews, and public consultation. By 2015, after 7 years of evaluation, the Department of Agriculture approved the importation and release of this tiny wasp on Christmas Island. Environmental authorities also gave their approval. Everything had been thoroughly checked. In December 2016, a research team flew to Malaysia. They collected 167 wasps and carefully placed them in small containers inside a secure box. An officer from the Department of Agriculture supervised the entire journey to Christmas Island. The wasps survived the trip at an almost perfect rate. Now came the difficult part. They needed to turn those 167 wasps into millions. Only then could they release enough of them to make a real impact on the enormous ant supercolonies dominating the island. They were essentially breeding an army. Christmas Island National Park rangers built specialized enclosures for the breeding program, while scientists from La Trobe University guided them through every step. They needed perfect conditions, the right temperature, the right humidity, and most importantly, plenty of yellow lac-scale insects for the wasps to parasitize. The team grew plant species that the scale insects particularly favored, and everything went according to plan. They introduced the scale insects onto these plants, creating an ideal breeding environment. The wasps laid their eggs inside the scale insects. New wasps emerged, and the population began to grow. By 2017, they carried out the first release. Rangers and scientists released 18,000 wasps at 4 locations affected by yellow crazy ants: Granswell, Blowholes, Margaret Knoll, and Circuit Tracks. Each site was filled with yellow crazy ants and the scale insect farms they depended on. The strategy was divided into 2 approaches. Half of the wasps were sent directly to the front lines, released straight into active ant supercolonies where scale insect densities were highest. Just as expected, once released, the wasps did not head down to the forest floor looking for ants. Instead, they flew straight into the tree canopy, where yellow lac-scale insects were clinging tightly to branches and feeding on plant sap. The female wasps were only about 2 millimeters long, almost disappearing among the leaves, but their method of attack was extremely precise. When a female found an adult female scale insect, she used her egg-laying organ to deposit eggs inside the host's body. A single wasp can lay up to 8 eggs inside one scale insect and parasitize more than 150 individuals over its lifetime. Once the eggs hatched, the larvae began developing inside the scale insect, using the host's own body as a food source until it died. The young wasps then emerged, searched for other scale insects, and repeated the cycle. In theory, the chain reaction was simple. More wasps meant fewer scale insects. Fewer scale insects meant less honeydew. Less honeydew meant less energy for the ants. Weaker ant supercolonies meant less pressure on the red crabs. But Christmas Island was not Malaysia. The climate was different, host densities were different, and the ants were still surrounding the scale insects to protect their precious sugar supply. 2 years passed. Scientists returned to monitoring sites that had once been packed with yellow crazy ants. In the past, simply placing a survey quadrat on the forest floor could reveal as many as 700 ants swarming across the leaf litter. This time, in the same area, they found just 10. Up in the trees, yellow lac-scale insects had also declined dramatically. The fueling stations that once supplied the ants with a constant flow of honeydew were gradually disappearing. Without that abundant sugar source, the supercolonies began to lose strength. Reproduction slowed, fewer worker ants were out foraging, and the territories they once controlled began to shrink. Then an even clearer sign appeared on the forest floor. The red crabs started coming back. They began digging burrows in areas that, only a few years earlier, had been almost completely covered by ants. Places that had once looked like ant cities were becoming crab habitat again. The real evidence appeared during the 2017 red crab migration, the same year the wasps were introduced. Around 40 to 50 million adult crabs made their annual journey to the ocean. That number remained relatively stable for years, suggesting a slow recovery supported by poison baiting programs. But by 2024, something remarkable had happened. The migration had grown to around 100 million crabs. The population had more than doubled. Scientists believe several factors contributed. The early baiting programs helped stabilize the population, but biological control using the wasps appears to have significantly accelerated the recovery. Areas where the wasps helped reduce ant numbers also showed some of the strongest rebounds in red crab populations. Rangers reported that the annual migration was becoming more spectacular each year. Crabs began digging burrows in areas they had been unable to occupy for decades. The forest floor was once again filled with red crabs processing fallen leaves, just as they had before the ant invasion. The ecosystem was showing clear signs of recovery, and the wasps deserved some of the credit. These tiny creatures, almost impossible to see with the naked eye, were winning the battle against one of the world's worst invasive species. They were helping save an entire ecosystem while almost no one could even see them working. But the job was far from finished. Yellow crazy ants still occupied large areas of the island. Remote regions that the wasps had not yet reached were still filled with ant supercolonies. Some locations required additional wasp releases. Other areas still needed poison baiting to maintain pressure on the ants. Scientists emphasize that Christmas Island may never be completely free of yellow crazy ants. The island's size and rugged terrain make total eradication nearly impossible, but controlling them is possible. As long as ant numbers can be kept at manageable levels, the ecosystem can continue to recover. And that success raises another question. If these wasps help save the red crabs of Christmas Island, what about the rest of the ecosystem? How far do those benefits spread? Because it is not just about the crabs. Red crabs do more than create a spectacular annual migration. They are ecosystem engineers. These crustaceans help maintain the health of Christmas Island's entire rainforest. Every year, they consume tons of fallen leaves. Leaf litter that would otherwise build up across the forest floor is processed by millions of hungry crabs. This helps keep the forest floor clear and maintains suitable moisture and temperature conditions. Nutrients are returned to the soil through crab waste, helping fertilize new plant growth. The crabs also eat certain young plants, thinning out dense undergrowth. This prevents the forest from becoming choked with too much vegetation. Sunlight can reach the forest floor. Air can circulate properly. The forest can breathe. When yellow crazy ant supercolonies killed the red crabs, the rainforest began to suffocate. Fallen leaves piled up everywhere. Seedlings grew so densely that they formed nearly impenetrable thickets. From the outside, the forest might have looked lush and green, but that appearance was misleading. The forest was actually beginning to die, slowly being smothered by its own unchecked growth. To be fair, even though this method has been highly effective, completely eliminating yellow crazy ants may be impossible. Yes, you heard that right. Just look at Johnston Atoll, a coral atoll in the Pacific Ocean that was also invaded by yellow crazy ants. There, the victims were not red crabs, but seabirds nesting on the ground. The ants crawled over the birds' bodies and sprayed formic acid into their eyes, causing injuries, blindness, infections, and in severe cases, death. So officials launched what was essentially a campaign to hunt down every last ant. Around 100 staff members and volunteers, divided into roughly 20 teams, spent more than 130,000 hours in the field over nearly a decade. They spread bait, returned to inspect each area, and continued searching for small surviving colonies. Because if even a few ants remained, all the previous work could be undone. By December 2020, they had even brought in 2 specially trained dogs capable of detecting yellow crazy ants by scent. The dogs covered about 118 miles of terrain without finding any more ants. Eventually, yellow crazy ants were considered eliminated from the target area. That might make it sound like Christmas Island could simply do the same thing. But look at the scale. Johnston Atoll is small, with relatively open terrain that is easier to search. Christmas Island covers about 52 square miles and is covered in dense tropical rainforest, large trees, valleys, and complex terrain. Ants can hide underground, beneath layers of leaf litter, or high above in the forest canopy. If Johnston Atoll was like searching for a needle in a room, Christmas Island is more like searching for millions of needles across an entire forest. That is why the realistic goal here is no longer to find and kill the very last ant. It is to collapse as many supercolonies as possible and keep ant numbers low enough for the red crabs and the ecosystem around them to recover. The story of Christmas Island shows that sometimes saving an entire ecosystem does not require a massive solution. It requires finding the weakest link, from billions of yellow crazy ants, to scale insects, to wasps only a few millimeters long, and finally to millions of red crabs returning to the forest. Everything is connected in ways that are almost hard to believe. What do you think? Should Australia continue using biological control to keep yellow crazy ant populations at safe levels? Or is the risk of introducing more organisms into the wild still too great? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe if you enjoy nature stories like this one. And in the next video, we are heading into an even more unbelievable story, one where humans tried to use one animal species to repair a mistake they had caused in the first place.